Alright, so in this lecture, we're going to be covering some of the tools that you'll need in terms of software and hardware to start developing for iOS. First and foremost, you will need a Mac of some sort. Now, it doesn't have to be the latest or the greatest, but it just has to be able to run OS X. So it's now called Mac OS. And the reason why we need Mac OS is because we need to install a piece of software called Xcode that will allow us to develop our iOS app. So this means that iPads, even iPad Pros, are out of the question. But if you had a iMac, or if you have a MacBook, or even a Mac Mini, it will work just fine. So if you don't already have a Mac and you don't want to invest a lot in, a brand spanking new top of the range MacBook, then one of the cheapest ways is probably just going onto eBay and getting a secondhand Mac Mini for around $500, and it's a pretty great deal and it'll do just fine. But what do you do if you only have a PC? Well, the other option is that you can go for something called Mac in Cloud. So if you head over to macincloud.com, they have a service where essentially they offer you a Mac in the cloud. So you can be using your PC and you have a remote connection to a Mac that is just for you, and it's already got Xcode pre-downloaded, so you can just get up and go. Now, there's a lot of people who ask about Hackintosh, or how can you run a Mac, sort of dual boot a Mac on your PC without having to pay for a service like Mac in Cloud. Well, there's a number of ways that you can do this, but one of the major downsides is that Apple is very strict about controlling their software and the environment in which their software runs. So even if you're using Mac in Cloud, or even if you're using a Hackintosh solution, you won't be able to run your app on a physical iPhone device that you own. The only way that you can do that is by having an actual Mac. But you will be able to run it on a simulator inside Xcode. So this is a simulated version of an iPhone, and for all intents and purposes, it will work just as well. It's just, say, if you're really excited about having your app on your iPhone, then you really need to find a way of either borrowing somebody's Mac or, getting one cheaply. I've detailed some resources in the text file of this lecture that talks about how you can go about exploring some of these ways of turning your PC into a Hackintosh. But I would still recommend try out some of the earlier solutions rather than going towards building a Hackintosh. It's just that we've had a lot of students on the in-person programming bootcamp who've tried to do this, and it's always given them a lot of headaches. So if you can really try and avoid this, this is almost the last-ditch solution. Now, the software that you'll be using is Xcode, and this is a piece of software that's written by Apple and allows you to write code, allows you to design your app, as well as run your app within the simulator that it comes with. And this is completely free, and in the next lecture, we'll be showing you how to download it and how to get it set up. So in order to be able to download Xcode 9, which is the version of Xcode that we'll be working with, your Mac's operating system has to be at minimum macOS Sierra, and it has to be 10.12.6 or above. Alternatively, and what I recommend, is to simply update to macOS High Sierra, which is the latest version of macOS. So it's a free update, and you can do it quite easily inside the Mac App Store, and that's macOS version 10.13 or above. So it's quite easy to check the version of macOS that you've got. So if you just head over to the Apple symbol here and you go to About This Mac, then you can see what is the version of macOS that you're running. And you can click Software Update in order to take you to the App Store where you can update your software. Alternatively, you can just head into the Mac App Store and search for macOS High Sierra, and it'll take you to the download page where you'll be able to download it for free. So usually what happens with Xcode is that they'll support the last version of macOS, so in this case it'll be Sierra, for a while, so maybe usually 4 to 6 months. And then the later versions of Xcode 9 will no longer support it, and it'll require you to update to macOS High Sierra. So macOS High Sierra is a intermediate update for Sierra. And it goes along the naming convention that Apple tends to use. So for example, when Lion was updated minimally, the version was called Mountain Lion, and similarly with Leopard and Snow Leopard. So this is Sierra and High Sierra. So there's no major dramatic changes, but there are some nice little tweaks and a few things that you might find to be quite useful. So you can have a browse on Apple's website, but one of the things that's quite cool that I've noticed is actually their photo editing software. The latest version that ships with High Sierra has almost Lightroom-like capabilities. So if you're an amateur photographer, these might be some cool tools that will help you. So for example, adjusting levels and white balance, etc. on your photos. And it makes it really easy and pretty neat. And there's a whole bunch of other things that they've added. Generally, I would say are just tweaks, things that make your life marginally better. I would recommend to update to High Sierra now if you haven't already done so. We've been testing the beta for a while and it's quite stable. And in order to use Xcode 9 in the future, you'll probably need to update at some point. So I recommend getting it now. So when you're testing your app, you've got the choice of either testing it on a physical device if you own an iPhone or an iPad. So because the course is aimed at teaching you how to make apps for iPhone, a lot of the designs that you'll be making and a lot of the project stubs will have the design and layouts optimized for iPhone. So it might look a little bit stretched, but it will work just fine. If you don't have an iPhone, you don't have to run out right away and get one. This is something that I would recommend, once you realize that you're really into this and you really want to carry on making apps for iPhone, or if you're at the point where you're about to release it on the App Store, then you have to test your app on a physical device. It's at this point when you would actually get an iPhone, so not straight away. So as I mentioned, Xcode comes bundled with a iOS simulator, and it's sort of like a virtual phone that runs on your computer, and you can essentially, use the rotate gestures, the shake gestures, you can zoom in and out, you can tap, etc. So it's just a simulated iPhone, and that works just as well. The only times when it doesn't really work so well is when you are using notifications, or if you're using Apple Health or Apple Home or some of those things, it can get a little bit tricky. All right, so another question that we get asked a lot is about universal development. So this is your cross-platform ways of developing apps for iPhone. The three that just came off the top of my head is PhoneGap, which uses HTML, CSS, and JS. Xamarin, which uses C#, and Appcelerator, which uses, again, JavaScript. So the advice that we tend to give students is that while this seems really appealing because you're essentially developing once and deploying it both on iOS and Android, you can do that simultaneously. The problem is that your user experience won't be as nice. You won't be able to tap into some of the native functionality of the phones. And in terms of design-wise, it's just not as pretty. And it's very obvious to a seasoned developer looking at something that's been done on cross-platform. So I would strongly recommend you actually learn to use the native tools because it is the most powerful and it'll allow you to build more complex apps in the future. And that's exactly what we'll be doing in this course. We're going to be using the professional tools, so Xcode, in order to make iOS apps. Another thing that you should always ask yourself before you make any app is, do you actually need an app, or can you actually make do with a mobile responsive website? Now, because we have a mobile app development agency as well at the London App Brewery, one of the things that we tend to recommend, we have a lot of clients who come to us and say, I want you to make this app. And we actually spend a lot of time turning people away and telling them, look, you can get this made much quicker and much cheaper by just getting a web designer to make a website for you that's mobile responsive, that scales nicely on the phone. Because unless you're tapping into some of the sensors within the phone, say if you need the location or if you need to be able to send people notifications, something that is inherent about the phone that you need. Otherwise, if you just need to display information, then making an app is a very time and money costly way of going about that. So always think about whether you actually need to make an app before you make any app. And finally, we're just going to mention that prior to Xcode 7, so Xcode 6, in order to actually download the app that you coded up, that you developed within Xcode, onto your physical iPhone device that you own, you actually had to pay Apple $99 a year in order to be on the Apple Developer Program. So as of Xcode 7, so I think that was September 2015, when it launched, you are now able to do this on any free Apple account. So all you need is just your normal iTunes account, which you use to download apps, and we'll be able to get it. We'll be able to get your code and your app onto your physical iPhone device. Now, when would you consider signing up for Apple Developer Program? This is when you're ready to launch your app onto the App Store and start generating revenue. So I would recommend that try to delay signing up for the Apple Developer Program as long as you can, because you're charged on a yearly basis, rolling essentially. So if you're not yet ready to take advantage of the Apple Developer Program, if you haven't got your app together yet, if you're not ready to upload to the App Store, then there's actually no point paying Apple for that privilege. So build your app, test it thoroughly. Once you're ready and about to launch it to the App Store, then start paying for your Apple Developer Program license. And this gets you access to something called iTunes Connect. This is a portal where you can upload your apps, you can check your app analytics, how many times it's been downloaded, how many people are using it, you can check your sales, you can see how much money you're making every day, etc., etc. So this is something that we're going to cover in one of the last sections when we guide you through how to actually upload an app to the App Store. So all of that is coming up. All right, so those were all the tools that you'll need in order to get started. And in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to install and set up Xcode so that you'll be able to get up and running very quickly and we can get started making our first app.